What's up, guys? This is John back again with another technical Minecraft Redstone video. This is John, yeah. So I've been working on some other technical stuff, and it's kind of a bunch of junk. I'm just gonna say it straight up. If you're not into technical videos, if you're not into like certain aspects of the game that really don't relate to playing in survival mode, then you're probably not going to enjoy this. But for those of you that might want to learn some interesting tricks for transmission and things like that, if you think that might be helpful to you, then by all means, please stick around because that is what this video is going to be all about. So straight off the bat, I am going to have a world download of this in case anybody wants to play around with anything or take a better look and see how things are made. So with that in mind, you can just ignore this because this has nothing to do with what the video is going to be about. But what the video is going to be discussing is a new type of transmission, or at least new to me, and probably new to most of you. This is going to be transmitting analog signals using, uh, I guess, what this would be called is probably a pulse width, um, I don't know, pulse width generator, pulse width transmitter, or pulse width modulation if you want. If you want to use a more realistic term, pulse width modulation maybe. So this is something that I saw from another YouTuber named CT5K, and I will leave a link to his channel in the description. But he came up with this really easy method to transmit analog signals down a redstone repeater line. So you can transmit an analog signal in pulse width and then decode that back into an analog signal. So I will just give you kind of a brief overview of this and how it works, and then we can get into some more technical stuff and some ways that you might be able to use this. So a pulse width transmitter is simply just a clock, in this case a 2-comparator clock that you see right here. And if we input a certain signal strength here in the back, then that signal strength is essentially going to cycle through this clock, which it would do forever if we didn't have this comparator here. So because we have a comparator uh, with a signal strength of 1, then that means whatever signal strength we input into the back is going to have 1 subtracted from it with each cycle of the clock. And so what that means is that if we input a certain signal strength, which I am doing here simply with observers and repeaters, because that just makes it easy to do testing and experimenting. But let's say that we give it a signal strength of 13, and you can see that it's going to last for a certain amount of time and gradually decay. So if we take that signal out with a repeater, then we can run that up to a pulse width receiver. And a pulse width receiver is simply going to be a repeater going into a comparator. This comparator is going to have a signal strength of 15, and if we subtract 14 from that with this comparator here, that's going to leave us with a signal strength of 1 here. And as time progresses, if we continue to have an input signal, then subtracting 14 and getting 1 here means that this is going to drop down to 13 because we're now subtracting 1 from that, and that's going to give us a signal strength of 2 here. So over time, as long as we continue to have an input, this signal is going to continue to increase. And it's going to increase until the point to where our input cuts off, and that is going to be the matching signal strength of the signal strength that we inputted on the system. So even though it is quite a mouthful to try to explain how it works, it's relatively simple. We have a decaying signal here, which we convert into a pulse width, which is going to turn into an incrementing signal here that is going to give us an analog signal output. So if we want to just run a couple tests, then we can see that we have a 3. So that's a 3, which is a very short signal. But once you get into the higher signal strength levels, then that's going to become a longer and longer signal. So with a 15, it's going to be a very long pulse. But you can see that we have 15 there. And there are multiple ways to make receivers for these. These are just both self-resetting analog signals, or analog memory cells, except this one actually increments, which is kind of funny. Alrighty, so one of the ways that you might actually use this in the game is by simply putting an analog signal into a comparator, having the comparator locked, and because we have a 2-clock comparator, or a 2-comparator clock here, then we're going to have to allow a 2-tick signal to be input into this. So we're just doing that here with an observer to give us 1 tick and 2 ticks on the repeater to allow that signal to output for 2 ticks. So whenever we do that, if we want to transmit a 7, then that should be transmitted there. Okay. All right, so even though this is going to be about pulse width transmission, there is another aspect of pulse width that I have been using, and that's very easy to do. So if you see here, we have basically the exact same setup with a couple differences in these two. So these are both going to be pulse width transmitters, this time with a 4-clock, because why not? I just felt like making it a 4-clock. So we still have our subtraction of 1 here. And you can see that on our inputs, I am going to be feeding it with a 4-tick signal. So if you want to transmit, just say like a 13, then we will get our 13 output here. Okay, so that's just a straight up pulse width, but with only a slight change. By changing the repeaters here down to 3 ticks, we can actually have a pulse counting transmitter. And the reason why I'm calling this a pulse counting transmitter is because, first of all, it's a transmitter, but second of all, it's going to produce a pulse which is going to be equal to the signal strength that we put in. So if we put in a 14 signal strength, we are actually going to count 14 different pulses. And so on the output here, I'm just using a 2-tick repeater to kind of smooth it out. And that is going to convert this back into, that's going to convert the pulses back into a pulse width signal here, which we can then convert back into analog. So there's our 14. So the reason why I am going over both pulse width and pulse counting is because they are essentially the same thing. Technically, we're both, or they're both using 4 clocks here, and realistically, we didn't even need to smooth this out. We could just go ahead and input that pulsing signal, and that will still increment and output the exact same signal as if this were pulse width, because we're still using a 4 clock. So my point is that even though this is pulse counting, it's essentially the same thing, but pulse counting does open up a new type of transmission that is essentially the same thing as pulse width, but different. And one of the surprising aspects of this is that you can use this in the game to transmit through different types of media. So the transmission that I'm talking about today is going to be mainly through different things that are not redstone related. So not strictly transmitting with redstone dust, but transmitting in other ways. And so the first that I'm going to be going over is going to be scaffolding. So what might surprise you guys is that you can actually transmit a signal up scaffolding. So if we use this type of arrangement with the scaffolding and we push a block under it with a piston, then that's going to trigger a change throughout the entire tower of scaffolding that can then be detected with observers. So if you watch the tail end of that observer, you can see that it produces an output whenever I both push the piston under and retract the piston. So our observer is going to output here. So if you can imagine that we just wanted to input a pulse width signal into this piston to turn it on and turn it off for a certain amount of time, then that can actually be detected with an observer, and we can use that with a T flip-flop to pretty much mirror what we're doing here on the ground. So if I turn this piston on, because the observer is going to detect the piston pushing the block under, that's going to trigger a T flip-flop, which will give us an output. So if I turn the piston off, then it's going to trigger to give us our off. So essentially, the pulse width signal can be directly transmitted up the scaffolding. So that's the pulse width. Now we can also use pulse counting up scaffolding. So coming off of an observer, if you just go straight out to a 4-tick repeater, then that gives you a pretty simple model for pulse counting. So let's see, if I give it a pulse on, then there's a pulse, and if we want to do like 1 and 2, then that was 1 and 2 pulses. Okay. On a side note, you can also transmit at different locations up the scaffolding. So it doesn't just have to be at the very bottom, it's anywhere that you have this type of a ledge. But one thing to note is that if we are supporting it like this with a block, then we cannot transmit anything from below that block. So it must be a completely standalone scaffolding tower, whatever. Whatever it is. So let's get into some models. So first we have the pulse counting model. We're just using a piston down there to transmit up the scaffolding. And we do have an observer with a 4-tick repeater. This is going out into a pulse width receiver, which is going to be outputting an analog signal. So let's just say that we want to send a 3. Then there's our 3 there, and we also have a receiver up there. So like I said, it's pulse counting, so the piston is just going to pulse for a certain amount of counts depending on whatever signal we choose to input, and that is going to be transmitted to the outputs. But because it's pulse counting, we can also use a different method of transmission, and that is with a receiver like this, and you can send more complex signals like a binary signal. Because the pulsing occurs at regular intervals, then it's pretty easy to do that. So there's a binary output. All right, so for the pulse width is a bit more complex to try to transmit with. So here, using the 4 clocks on the repeater and the four comparator clock, you can see that the piston is just going to turn on once and then turn off. So straight up pulse width. But if we come out again to the T flip-flop, then we can use that to transmit our analog signal. Okay, so in most cases, depending on the type of media, one of these systems, either the pulse counting or the pulse width, is going to be better than the other. But in this system, you cannot, because we're just using a piston turning on and off once. You cannot transmit anything too complex like the binary signal over there. You're really just stuck with transmitting on the rising edge and the falling edge. So here I can like input a 3 and I can get a 3 out there if I wanted to, or like a 13. So you can transmit in different ways, but it's not It's not really as complex as a binary model like that. But you can still, you know, you can still count like that's 1 through 15. So I guess if you wanted to, you could try to convert that into binary or something, whatever. All right, so some other methods of transmission, because most of the stuff in this video is going to be about vertical transmission. You can transmit up a bubble column. So this idea I got from just somebody on Java, because theirs is actually instant. You can instantly transmit up a bubble column. But nothing is instant in Bedrock, and if it's instant, then it's going to be like different timing. But so here we go. With a bubble column, you can transmit both on the rising and the falling, or the creation and the collapse of the bubble column. So that was creating a bubble column, and if we turn that back into water, then you can see that it's going to transmit as well. It's just extremely slow. So the bubble column has two different modes. It's got the creation, which is very fast, and it's got the dissolution, or the turning back into water, which is very slow. But using the pulse counting model, we can still transmit at a somewhat decent rate. So just basically pulsing the dispenser down there to create a bubble column, and we can transmit. So the pulse counting, or the pulse width model, wouldn't really work in this, just because it has two modes of transmission on the on and the off. But you can still transmit pretty well with pulse counting. All right, some other things that I played around with, using a daylight sensor. You can, this is a pulse counting model, but you could also do a pulse width if you wanted to. We're just ejecting a bucket of water here, and the daylight sensor can pick that up, and we can transmit. Okay. One of the dumbest ways to transmit is going to be with falling water. So I have both the pulse counting and a pulse width model. Pulse counting, literally, it's just going to be chunks of water falling down. We are detecting that with a piece of string in front of an observer. And just to say that if you input a signal of 15, you're literally going to get 15 pieces of falling water, so it takes a while. But we could also do the pulse width model, which is just the turn on and the turn off. And because the observer is just detecting the rising edge and the falling edge of the water, then that is actually much quicker than the pulse counting model. So depending on the type of media that you're using, one of these is going to be better than the other, whether it's the pulse counting or the pulse width. But we could also do something like this, which is dropping items. So dropping items, of course, with a very fast clock, it's pretty easy to just do the pulse counting model. And we're just collecting the items down there with the hopper, taking the output with a comparator, and that's going to give us a proper transmission. So 2 items, basically just spit out 2 items and you count 2. But because items can be dropped at regular intervals, we could also use a more complex form of transmission, which is going to be just like with the other one, which is binary. So pulse counting is good for sending more complex signals like this, even though sometimes it is slower. So there's our signal there. Another interesting aspect of the items is that you could use a dropper elevator to take items back up. So we can use a dropper to spit out items and count them at the bottom. So you can transmit down, which is that. Or if you wanted to, you could transmit items straight up an item elevator. So the circuitry is the same in both cases. We're just collecting the items with a hopper and counting them. Okay, so there is that. All right, so let's get into some more complex stuff. So I really wanted to kind of flesh out the idea of pulse width transmission because to me it's pretty neat. It's so quirky when you start developing systems based on pulse width. So I have a switch here. So with pulse width, if we wanted to transmit something a bit more complex or a bit more data heavy, then you can do that in pulsing in chains. So in this case, we just have a bunch of different inputs, and after one fires, it's going to have a bit of a delay, and then the next is going to fire. But the complete signal is going to be the sum of the width of all the pulses. So if we were to just transmit a very low signal strength, like a 1111, then the signal is going to be very short. If we transmit like 15s, all 15s, then it's going to be, the complete transmission is going to be very long. So it's very interesting to me because there's no on and there's no off to the signal or to the transmission signal. Like it's not set in stone. So I wanted to do something a bit more complex. So I went ahead and made um, a network system, which is going to be using addresses. So if you want to play around with this in a world download, then all you need to do is come to each of these, and you can select a number here, and this is going to be the address for this location. So let's just say that I want to make this address 12, and then if you come down here all the way to the bottom, let's just say that we pick address number 12, and we wanted to transmit something to it, then you can just pick that here. And for most of these, you can pick the first 4 values. If you want to transmit to the one there in the middle that actually has 8 outputs, then you have to come here and flip this on, and that will allow the transmitter to read the final 4 outputs there. But just as a demo, you input your address and your different signals, and whenever it finds the output, it's going to have a little lamp there that's going to turn on, and that's just to show you that we are receiving data. So nothing else is going to change because it's all addressed. So the only one that's going to change is going to be the one that you select. But one of the caveats to this is that because this is a pulse width transmission, there's not going to be a way to output a 0. So because this is just going to be one analog value right after the other, there's no way to input a 0. There's no way to tell the system that there is a 0, much less, because every signal coming out is going to be a piece of an analog value. So there's no way to make a 0. But yeah, so that one's transmitting there. But there are some pretty neat aspects to a system like this. So first of all, this is infinitely expandable. So if you wanted to have more inputs and outputs, you could simply just copy and paste more on here. And likewise with the outputs, really all you need to do is copy this and paste it at the back, because that's the way that I designed it. The way that I designed this system, I was thinking about something else, which was something that I made in a previous video regarding the 7-bit address system, and I was talking about, like, what if there's a way to make an infinite number of addresses? And this system would actually allow you to do that. So the way that this works is our first input value, which is going to be whatever signal strength, it's going to come out here, and it's going to check this against whatever our address value is. So if the first input matches the address, then it's going to unlock this comparator here. And because our signal is going to be composed of pretty much non-stop inputs, Once all the inputs are finished, then the signal is done. So the way that this works is that this is going to remain unlocked for as long as we keep receiving information, right? So as long as we still have inputs outputting a signal, this is going to keep receiving. So this will never turn off, so essentially you could have as many addresses as you want. This is like infinitely expandable. I mean, as many outputs as you want. But so just to say, if it does not, if their first value does not match the address value, then this is going to remain locked indefinitely until our input is over. So the thing that I was thinking about was actually, what if we take this addressing section and instead of having the outputs go to these outputs here, what if we just have the outputs go to another address system? And then what if we have that output go to another address system? So you could essentially just chain the addresses to where, you know, your first 3 or 4 different inputs had to match that particular address for it to output in that output section. So what that means is that instead of just having, in this case, 15 different addresses, we could have a first 15 addresses, and then for each of those addresses, we could have 15 different addresses, and for each of those addresses, we could have 15 addresses. And considering that the system is infinitely expandable, you could technically have an infinite amount of addresses that you could send an infinite amount of data to if you wanted to go that route, if you wanted to play around with it. So that's just kind of mind-blowing to me because it's very simple once you consider how we are transmitting and receiving the information. But that just goes to show how strong the signal strength or the pulse width transmission is, because this is all just pulse width. So you can transmit through many different types of media. Basically anything that can turn on or off in the game, or move, or falling water. You could make it flowing water. Um, you could make it a mine cart. Mine carts could transmit data, things like that. But so if you wanted to play around with this, it does not have to be just up the scaffolding. You could also transmit with redstone dust. And let's just say that we want to transmit to just say a different location. So say like we want to do 5, 4. Let's do 5, 4, 3, and 2, just to prove that it works. So let's say that I wanted to transmit to address number 13. So where is address number 13? Where is address number 13? Oh, you freaking jerk. Oh, you had to break right whenever I was trying it out. Yeah, so this, if you don't know, this is a wireless transmitter. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it just wasn't. You jerk. Oh, you changed transmission modes. Okay, so that's not going to be reliable. Okay, let me try again. Yeah, whenever I first... Oh, man, you know what the issue is? I forgot I made a switch. Okay, hold on 1 second. So you can actually transmit pulse through the pulse counting method. You can transmit to my previously made like year-old like wireless transmitters. Okay, just rewind, completely forget that I screwed everything up, and let's go back to the funny joke of let's transmit to address number 13. Where's address number 13? Okay, so see our receiving light came on. So you can, yeah, wireless redstone still works. So you can transmit with pulse width there's our 5, 4, 3, and 2. So you can transmit to wireless nodes using the pulse width transmission model. Because with pulse width, it doesn't matter what this thingy is doing, because every time something flops or farts in the world, it's going to trigger this thing. Using the pulse width, it's pretty easy because you just come out with some repeaters to correct the timing. And then you can actually have a wireless network address that you can transmit an infinite amount of data to. Completely pointless in the game, in survival mode, but still pretty fun to tinker around with. Yeah, but if you want it to transmit to the wireless one, you have to use the pulse transmitter. That's what this is. This is a pulse width to pulse counting transmitter. Yeah, because we're using 4 clocks, you can just use a comparator with a repeater to kill it, and that will give you the correct timing going to a piston, and you can transmit to a wireless node. Pretty nice. So that's pretty much it for the transmission. There are a couple of other things in the world. This one I'm not going to get into playing with because it just takes too long. But I will tell you what it is, and if you want to play with it. So first of all, we need to start the clock in the back. So you have to check this clock. When I built this, I had intended this to be more permanent storage, but Minecraft Bedrock decided not to let it be more permanent storage. So you have to check the clock if you want to play with this. This is a hard drive, or rather a bunch of hard disks. But this clock, even though it's supposed to be just a single tick going around, sometimes it'll erase itself or duplicate itself. You'll see like 2 or 3 ticks going around. So you have to correct that. Likewise, the signals can duplicate themselves, which is what you see here. But this is intended to be a hard drive, just to test out the principle, and that has a total capacity of 1100 bits, something around there. So it is very slow. But if you wanted to play around with it, I do have kind of instructions here. You basically just choose a location and you can write 4 different analog signals to it at once. But to give you a really, really brief walkthrough of how that works, we just have a clock, which is similar to the clock there on the ground. We are going to be outputting a signal from each clock cycle. So in this case, it's a 4 clock, so we can take 4 different timings out of it. We're using those timings to allow us to read or write to a particular comparator in this comparator clock. So just say that if I wanted to select a location number 1, that's a 5, which I don't think it was a 5 the last time. But if you wanted to erase that, you could erase it. Or if you wanted to write a new value, then we can write 3 there. And if we wanted to just say that we wanted to read and write something else, then we can erase whatever that value was. And we can come back here and we should still have the same data that we saved a minute ago. So this is pretty neat if anybody wants to look at that. I'll just kind of give you, because, you know, people, not like I want to sound arrogant or anything, but people have said before that I should make like redstone classes to show how I come to build things like this. And the way that I came across thinking about this was like this. So we have a 4 comparator clock over there. So imagine that we have a 4 comparator clock and we have signals going through that. Then just say that choosing this comparator here, let's just say that I wanted to erase the data that's in that comparator and I want to replace it with something else. So we know that we can erase a signal with a repeater. So even though everything else stopped, that's not the point. So right now we are killing off the signal in the comparator. So let's just say, what if I now wanted to inject a new signal? So we can inject a new signal by adding a comparator here. So we can have a different analog value than this. But if all of the timings were correct, then if I turn this lever off here, then we would have a seamless transition from this input to that input, right? But you can see that we do not have a seamless transition. So the reason why is because to turn on a repeater, it takes one tick, and it also takes another tick to kill the comparator. But here we're injecting our signal with just a single tick of delay. So really all we need to do is increase that delay with another comparator, and now we should have a seamless transition from one to the next. So if anybody's wondering how you write to a comparator clock like that, you essentially just have two comparators here and a repeater here. And I am using two comparators to allow our input to be synchronized with our clock timing there. So if I choose a particular location, then that's only going to allow us to write for a single tick out of the clock, but that is all we need to be able to save a particular value to that individual comparator. So we just saved a value to that comparator. If we wanted to, we can erase a value from that comparator. And of course, it's going to be erasing and saving to a single comparator only, so the other three comparators are not affected. So yeah, it's just something I thought was pretty neat, and I wanted to play around with and build that big monstrosity. Yeah, I don't know why I left this here. I guess I was just reminiscing. So this is, I guess I was going to say that clocks are pretty familiar to me because the first thing that I ever did in Minecraft, once I learned that you could play with redstone and make different circuits and things, I wanted to be able to make a transmitter or a single line that could transmit more than one thing at a time. So the point of this is to be able to transmit more than one signal down a single redstone line. And the way that I'm doing that is just with two clocks and some AND gates. So if we make an AND gate from our transmitter to our receiver, so you can see that we just have our dust coming in to all these repeaters, and that's just going to AND gates here. And on the back side, we're just taking signals off of our receiver's clock. Then you can use that to transmit a signal. In this case, let's see if I delay that. Oh, then I'm going to need to delay it more and more. So because the clocks can become unsynchronized from each other, you can change their synchronization simply by adding or removing delay in the transmission line. But in this case, if you wanted to transmit different signals, then you can transmit like that. So this was one of the first things that I've ever built, and I used it to transmit binary from a transmitter to a receiver. So I know it's kind of funny, probably kind of laggy, but you gotta know that at the time that I designed this, there was literally like two people on YouTube that actually designed working single wire transmitters and receivers. So nobody else made anything like this. I think this is pretty much original to me, just because it's really laggy. But you know, there was only like Cass from My Zuma Games and like one other person that was actually transmitting a serial signal across a dust line. So I thought this was pretty neat. But anyway, so that's going to be it for the video. if you want to test any of this stuff out in the world download, make sure if you want to transmit to the wireless node over there that you have to flip the switch here. Otherwise, you might embarrass yourself. But anyway, so that's it. I'm probably going to, in the future, going to be working on some more categorizers. I've already had some designs in mind, and apparently a lot of people are interested in categorizers because I've had uh, other, other people that saw my videos on YouTube that have had some other ideas. So I kind of like that we go from a couple of years ago having 0 categorizers to having everybody has an idea for some kind of categorizer, and typically they're pretty fast. So anyway, that's it, and I will see y'all in another video.